Hi, my name is Debra, this is Booking with Debra. The point of today's video is to do a reading wrap-up for my Read Around the World challenge. I started my Read Around the World challenge before I had a booktube channel, and what I was trying to do was just challenge myself to read books from different countries across the world. Ideally, a book from every country across the world as a long-term challenge. And I set myself some criteria. So the criteria that I have is that the author either needs to be from that country, so they're living in that country, or they were born in that country and maybe living somewhere else. It may be that the author's family heritage is from that country, so their parents or grandparents, and they're writing about their family experience, or that the author has spent a considerable amount of time living in the country. With regards to the books that I pick, they usually come from one of two places. It's either a book I already own, or it's a book that I can borrow from the library. The aim of the challenge really was just to ensure that I am reading as diversely as possible from different countries across the world, but also to help me to find new authors and learn about places in the world that I'm not familiar with. So my original idea when I started this channel was that I would read books from a particular country, potentially multiple books, and then read them over time and then record videos about that country. So I have done one video on my channel already, which I will link in the comments section down below, on the books that I read for Cuba, and I also shared some details of some documentaries that I watched for Cuba. One of the things that I found as time's going on is that original plan that I had is not lending itself to the sort of reader that I am. I'm quite a mood reader, and I'm also quite a spontaneous reader, and what I was finding is I was starting to read a book for a particular country with a view to reading more books later on, but not getting round to reading other books, and therefore not actually managing to talk about the books on my channel in my videos. And the other thing that I was finding was that because I was separating out my Read Around the World books when I was doing my wrap-ups, my wrap-ups were not really representative of all of the books I was reading, because I was separating those books out. So what I've decided going forward is that I'm just going to integrate the Read Around the World books that I choose in my TBR videos, and I will include them in my normal monthly wrap-ups. I also had this idea that I was going to watch different documentaries about different countries or maybe films and include those in the videos, but I am finding, as anyone will tell you who has a YouTube channel, that actually having the YouTube channel and reading the books that I want to read is kind of enough of a hobby really in itself, without trying to put lots of pressure on myself to watch lots of documentaries and films and review those as well. So I'm putting that to one side. So today's video is a summary of all of the books that I have read this year for my Read Around the World challenge. And I also thought I would share the star ratings that I gave each of the books that I have read. Up until now I haven't been sharing my star ratings on my channel because I'm very aware that my star ratings are very individual to me, and they can be very subjective, and they can and do change over time, so I was a little bit reluctant to share them. But I do think it might be interesting for people to see how I've rated books, and I do appreciate it when other people share their star ratings on their channels. So as I said, these are the books that I've read for a Read Around the World between January and May of this year. Obviously that means I read some of these books quite a while ago. I'm being kind to myself in this video, and I'm actually using some notes on my laptop to help me talk about some of these books. So if you see me looking down here, that's what I'm doing. Today I have 5 books to talk about from the countries of Nepal, Burundi, Poland, Egypt, and a book that covers Korea and Japan. And in terms of the star ratings that I gave those books, one is a 3-star, one is a 3.5 star, one is a 4-star, and I've got 2 5-star reads. The first book that I wanted to talk about was for the Read Around the World for Nepal, and that is a book called The Gurkha's Daughter by Parajuly. This book was nominated for the Dylan Thomas Prize. This collection of stories has 8 short stories following different characters from the Nepalese diaspora from Nepal, India, Bhutan and Manhattan. Like all short story collections, there were some stories in this book that I enjoyed more than others, and some of the stories that have stayed with me more than others. What I thought I would do is just share some of the standout stories that I've found in this collection. The first one of those was called A Father's Journey, and that was a story about Prabin and his relationship with his daughter Supriya. It explored the time in Supriya's life where she had the onset of puberty, and it explored the practice of menstrual untouchability, which was not something that I was familiar before having read this story. And it looked at how their relationship became more distant over time. Another story that stood out for me was The Gurkha's Daughter, and that explored the relationship that a daughter has with her father, who was a Gurkha. And it looked at that sort of post-imperial limbo that is experienced by some Gurkha soldiers and what it means for them and their families. Another standout story for me was No Land is Her Land, which was a story about Anamika, who was a Nepalese-Bhutanese refugee who was forced to flee Bhutan with her baby because of her ethnicity. And it explored her time in a refugee camp where she felt forced to marry a man for the safety and security of herself and her baby. This explored a part of Bhutanese Nepalese history that I knew nothing about, which was a time when 106,000 Nepalese were exiled from Bhutan. Overall, I gave this short story collection 3.5 out of 5 stars. This collection really did give me a much wider understanding of the country of Nepal and Nepalese people. But like you often find with short story collections, you do enjoy some stories more than others. The next country that I have read a book for is Burundi, and that book was A Small Country by Gaël Faye, and this was published in 2016. And this book was translated from the French by Sarah Ardizone. Small Country describes the life of a 10-year-old boy, Gabriel, living in Burundi in the 1990s. At first in a period of relative peace, we meet his family and his friends, then his childhood innocence is brutally lost during the conflict between the Hutus and the Tutsis. We also find out about Gabrielle's mother, who fled Rwanda, and we see the impact that the events in Burundi have on her. So this story is all told from the perspective of Gabrielle, so it's told from a child's perspective. However, this book is definitely an adult book. It is intended for an adult audience. There are some really hard-hitting and difficult scenes in this book, and it really did highlight just how quickly the violence escalated in Burundi during that time. I gave this book a 5 out of 5 stars. I felt like the narrative of this book was very powerful because we were seeing the world from a child's point of view and through a child's eyes, in that sense of his innocence and the loss of his innocence as the world around him erupted into violence. I found the writing style of this book very approachable, even though it did tackle some very difficult themes and it had some difficult scenes in it. There was one really standout quote in this book that I wanted to share. "Genocide is an oil slick. Those who don't drown in it are polluted for life." So even though this book does very much focus on Gabriel when he's younger, the story starts out with him as a young man living in France, and as the novel progresses we go back in time to his childhood and then move through time back to him as an adult living in France. I thought the title of this book was very interesting, Small Country. Obviously Burundi is one of the smallest countries in Africa, so it was referring to that sense of Burundi being a small country. But I also think you get the sense in the book of Gabrielle's world being so small. We see his local community, we get to know his neighbours, we get to know his family and friends. So it's almost like how the small country of a child and how that is changed and kind of almost like broken as the violence and the genocide erupted. This book has been made into a film and I really would like to see it at some point if I could, but I've not been able to find it anywhere. As I said, this was a 5-star read for me. The next country that I read around the world for was Poland, and that book was Swimming in the Dark by Tomasz Jedrowski. Set in early 1980s Poland, against the decline of communism, a story of first love between two young men who eventually find themselves on opposite sides of the political divide. I listened to this book on audiobook and I thought the narration was fantastic for this book. The narrator was Robert Nairn. This is a coming-of-age gay love story. The writing style was very poetic and very lyrical at times. It was absolutely full of feeling and it was really sensual. I found it really intimate and passionate at times, and you really did get a sense of those desires and emotions that come from first sexual experiences, and it was really beautifully written at times. The main narrator of this book is Ludwig himself. It explores Ludwig's life living with his grandmother and mother in communist Poland in the 1960s, and how he comes to meet Janus at an agricultural camp and how they go on to form a relationship. One of the things that I found most interesting about this book was how it explored communist Poland in the 1980s, systems at the time that operated, the way gay people were being treated at the time, and how the main characters felt and perceived those things. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. The one thing that I did struggle with at times, and I think it's because I was listening to it on audio, was the timeline when the narrator was talking about time spent in the past with their mother and grandmother, and then more recent times, and then going back in time to the time when they met Janus, and every now and then I would feel a little bit lost in the timeline as to where we actually were. But as I said, I think that came from listening to it on audiobook, and would imagine it would be less of an issue if you were actually reading the book. The next country that I read a book for was Egypt, and that book was A Pure Heart by Rajia Hassib. This is a contemporary fiction book about 2 sisters who have chosen very different paths in life. The first character that we get to know is Rose, and she is an American Egyptian who is living in New York and working as an Egyptologist at a museum. We find out all about her backstory of how she came to leave Egypt and be living in New York, and her relationship with her husband, who was an American who converted to Islam in order to marry her. And then we meet the sister Camilla. She lives in Cairo with her parents and is much more traditional and much more devout in her faith. The narrative in the story moves between Egypt and America. We know from the outset of this book that Camilla has died in a suicide bombing attack. Set during the Arab Spring Revolution in Egypt 2012, the novel explores the family tensions the events create. Rose believes that if she examines her sister's possessions, she will be able to understand her sister's life better. But in doing so, she realises how little she really knew her sister. Rose also believes that in some way her husband is responsible for her sister's death. In addition to those main characters, we're also introduced to another character of a man who is radicalised while in prison in Egypt, and as the story evolves we learn to understand how he is connected to the sisters. This book did explore some interesting themes around marriage, interfaith marriage, the impact that bereavement and grief can have on relationships, and also how a relationship can be impacted when you move from one country to another. It was interesting to get to know the 2 sisters, Rose and Camilla, and how they chose to live their lives so differently, and the role that their faith and their religion had in their lives. However, I only gave this book 3 out of 5 stars. It did have some interesting themes, and we did get to understand quite a lot about the sisters in terms of what motivated them. The book also left me wanting to learn more about the Arab Spring and to go and find out a little bit more about that. However, I did find the story quite slow at times, and it wasn't a book that I kept wanting to go and pick up. I had to sort of keep forcing myself to keep reading this book. And then the final book that I wanted to talk about in today's wrap-up is Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. I read this book as part of a read-along with Gem of Books and a group of other people, and I will link Gem's channel in the description box down below. This was quite a chunky read for me at 530 pages, and the plan was that we were going to read the book over the month of April. I am not a particularly fast reader, and I was really concerned that I wouldn't be able to keep up with the read along and that I would quickly get behind, because some days I don't read at all and other days I only read 2 or 3 pages. The book is separated into 4 parts, so I thought I would get a bit of a head start with this book and start reading a little bit early with a view to having the first part of the book read when the read along started at the beginning of April, and then I thought I would be able to keep up with everybody. It didn't quite go to plan for me, in the sense that once I started reading this book, I just could not stop reading it. I couldn't stop at the book 1. I just had to keep reading and finding out what was going to happen next. So I didn't do a very good job of following along with the read-along group with this book. I am so grateful to Jem for organising this read-along, because I'd had this book on my shelves for probably a couple of years and I did feel a bit intimidated by the size, but I am so glad that I picked it up, and it was a much quicker and a much more engrossing read than I ever could have envisaged. Spanning nearly 100 years of history, Pachinko is an unforgettable story of love, sacrifice, ambition and loyalty, told through 4 generations of one family. It starts out in Korea in 1910, where we discover the family history and the family background of Sunja. Under difficult circumstances, Sunja feels she has to make a decision to travel to Japan, following a man she barely knows to a hostile country where she has no friends. Sunja will be forced to make some difficult choices. Her decisions will echo through the decades. This book is absolutely packed with historical details, and it covers 100 years of Korean and Japanese history. It explores a very early immigrant experience for Korean people who went to Japan and were forced to live in ghettos. No one will rent to Koreans. You can't imagine a dozen in a room that should be for 2. Men and families sleeping in shifts. Pigs and chickens inside homes. No running water, no heat. The Japanese think Koreans are filthy, but they have no choice but to live in squalor. Even in the later years of this book, it was so interesting to find out about the immigrant experience and how challenging and difficult that must have been. And one of the things this book really did make me reflect on was what it feels like to be an immigrant in a different country and to be treated as an outsider, and some of the systems and processes that are put in place that mean you will always feel like an outsider and you will always feel excluded. I'm aware that Min Jin Lee spent 30 years writing this book, and it states at the back of the book that she did over 100 interviews with Korean immigrants living in Japan as part of the history for this book, and I think you can really, really tell the work that's gone into this book. And it was the first book written in English that explored the Korean immigrant experience in Japan. Explored concepts like what is home and how do we find a home, particularly when the home that we had, which was Korea for this family, is no longer as it was. So obviously at a point in history, Korea was separated into North and South Korea, and Sunja's family didn't feel that they belonged in Japan, but they didn't feel like they belonged in Korea either. The book also explored the ideas of the kind of model minority or the good immigrant, in terms of, if you try hard enough and you're better than the best, you might just be good enough to belong, versus that kind of idea of the perpetual foreigner, which is that no matter what you do, you will always be excluded from the mainstream. One of the enduring themes throughout the whole of this book was the ideas around generational trauma, the impact of the stigma and the shame that is placed upon immigrant populations through no fault of their own, and how they can experience exclusion and bullying and have very limited opportunities to kind of succeed or progress or make it in the world, and the hugely devastating impact that can be felt for generations to come. Another interesting theme that I feel Pachinko explores was this idea of how the children suffer generationally for the mistakes of the parent. So I won't give any spoilers in this book, but sometimes in this book the characters make certain choices or do certain things that then have huge implications for not just them and their children, but their children's children and their children's children, in a way that you just can't comprehend at the time. So it's this idea that if you bring shame on your family, your entire family is expected to kind of continue to suffer from that, and the only way that you can prevent your family from continuing to suffer from your mistakes is to remove yourself from the family. Another interesting theme that I felt that was in this book was that role of being a parent, and what does it mean for you as a parent when there is nothing you can do to enable your child to fulfil their dreams or the dreams you have for the child. So the thing I would say about this book is, even though it was 530 pages, it moves through time really quite quickly, but not in a way that you feel like it's rushing. You sort of get hooked into the story of Sunja, who is kind of the main character at the beginning, and you're just taken on this journey through her life, and not just her life, but the lives of her children and her children's children, and other people that she meets along the way, and other people that influence their family. And you get to share some of the most fundamental moments in the lives of the families and what that means for generations to come. This book was such an accessible read for me. I really didn't think the book would be such a quick read. It was 530 pages and I just couldn't stop reading it, and I think I read it in 3 weeks, which is really fast for me. And I didn't want to read anything else when I was reading it, so even though I was supposed to be reading it as part of a read along and like pausing and checking in with a read along, I just went for it. I just kept on reading because I just wanted to know what was going to happen for these characters, and you know, where their lives were going to go and how everything was connected. There were some parts of this book that were very emotional, and there were some very difficult scenes in this book, so obviously if you're thinking about reading it, you may want to look at trigger warnings. I won't go into what those triggers are because I don't want to give any spoilers, but there were some really difficult things that happened for some of the characters that just had a really profound effect on me, and I think some of the characters in this book and some of the things that happen in this book will stay with me for a very long time, so you won't be surprised to hear that this book was a 5-star read for me. Also, this book is being adapted for screen. I believe it's on Apple TV, which I currently don't have access to, but I would love to watch the TV adaptation of this book. I'd love to see how it is brought to the screen. So just before I wrap up this video, for all of the books that I have read for my Read Around the World challenge so far this year, I will just mention that I also read a book for Ukraine at the very beginning of this year called Good Citizens Need Not Fear by Reva, but I did talk about that in another wrap-up video, so I will link that video in the description box down below. And that was a short story collection written by an author of Ukrainian heritage. Some of the stories were about life in Ukraine under Soviet rule and then post-Soviet collapse in Ukraine. At the time that I read it, I didn't realise how timely that book would be, but it was an interesting collection of short stories to read. So those are all of the books that I wanted to wrap up and I wanted to discuss for my Read Around the World challenge. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, going forward I'm going to include my Read Around the World books just into my normal monthly wrap-ups. Before I go, it would be really interesting to hear from you in the comments if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them, did you enjoy them, are you interested in reading any of these books, or if you've got any books that you could recommend to me for my Read Around the World challenge, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. If you just want to say hi in the comments and let me know how you are and what you're reading, please do so. I really do appreciate everyone who takes the time to like my videos, to comment on my videos, to watch my videos. So thank you so much. That's everything for today. Thanks very much for watching. Take care. Bye.